Hey, welcome to LGBT Friends channel. Please subscribe if you're new and comment below where you're watching from. I love reading your messages. Thank you. The last time I saw my best friend truly happy was on the day he got married. His name is Dave, and I've known him for most of my life. We grew up in the same neighborhood, went to the same schools, and spent most of our younger years doing the kind of stupid things boys do when they think they're invincible. Somewhere along the way, that friendship just stuck. No matter how busy life got, we always stayed close. On his wedding day, he looked like the luckiest man alive. I still remember him standing there in his suit, adjusting his tie every few minutes like he was nervous he might mess something up. But every time he looked at his bride, that nervousness disappeared. He just smiled. During the reception, he kept grabbing my shoulder and laughing, like he still couldn't believe everything was real. "Can you believe this?" he said at one point. I told him the truth. "You look happier than I've ever seen you." And he really did. For the first time in years, it felt like everything in his life had fallen perfectly into place. 3 months later, Dave's wife died in a car accident. The phone call came early in the morning. I remember staring at the screen for a long time after it ended, trying to process what I had just heard. Nothing prepares you for news like that, especially when it happens to someone you care about. After that, everything changed. The man I had known for years, the one who was loud, confident, always joking about something, became quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the heavy kind. The kind that sits in a room and makes everything feel smaller. He stopped going out, stopped answering calls. Some days he barely replied to my messages. When I did see him, he looked like he hadn't slept in days. I didn't push too hard at first. Grief doesn't work on a schedule. But after months of watching him slowly disappear into that silence, I started to worry. So one evening I showed up at his place unannounced. He opened the door looking tired, like he had just woken up from a nap that didn't really help. "We're going hiking," I told him. He blinked at me. "What?" 3 days. Mountains. Fresh air. No phones. He immediately shook his head. "No way." But I didn't move. Eventually he sighed, running a hand through his hair like he didn't have the energy to argue anymore. "Fine," he muttered. 3 days. The drive to the mountains was quiet, but not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that happens between people who have known each other long enough not to fill every moment with words. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was already dropping behind the trees. The air smelled like pine and cold mountain wind. Inside, the cabin was small. Just one room, a tiny kitchen, and a wooden bed near the wall. I set my bag down, then looked at the bed. There was only one. He followed my gaze, then looked back at me and shrugged. "Guess we're sharing." We didn't talk much about the bed after that. It was the kind of thing that felt awkward only if you made it awkward. We had known each other for years, shared hotel rooms on trips before, slept on couches after late nights out. It shouldn't have been a big deal. Still, something about this felt different. Maybe it was the cabin. Maybe it was the quiet mountains outside. Or maybe it was the fact that life had changed so much for him in the past few months. We spent the evening doing simple things. Unpacking our bags, heating up the food we had brought, sitting outside the cabin steps while the sky slowly turned dark behind the trees. For the first time in a while, he seemed a little lighter, not fully himself yet, but closer. That alone made the trip feel worth it. By the time we went inside, the night air had turned cold. The cabin creaked softly as the temperature dropped, the wooden walls adjusting to the mountain chill. He grabbed his towel and took a quick shower first. I waited on the small couch, scrolling aimlessly through my phone until the water stopped running. When he came out, his hair was still damp, and he looked more relaxed than I'd seen him in weeks. I took my turn in the bathroom after that. The shower was simple, just hot enough to wash off the dust from the hike. When I stepped back into the main room, the lights were dim, and he was already lying on one side of the bed. There was a moment where we both just looked at the situation again. One bed. He shifted slightly and lifted the blanket. "Don't overthink it," he said with a small smirk. "It's a big bed." I laughed quietly and climbed in on the other side. For a while, neither of us moved. I stayed close to the edge of the mattress, staring up at the wooden ceiling while the faint sound of wind moved through the trees outside. The room felt strangely quiet. Not empty, just aware. After a few minutes, I became conscious of little things. The slow rhythm of his breathing, the warmth coming from his side of the bed, the occasional rustle of blankets when one of us shifted slightly. It felt like my senses were suddenly paying attention to everything. I turned slightly onto my side. At the same moment, he did the same. For a brief second, our eyes met in the dim light coming from the window. Neither of us said anything. Then he exhaled quietly and looked back at the ceiling. "Thanks for dragging me out here," he said after a moment. His voice was softer than usual. "I mean it." I shrugged lightly, even though he probably couldn't see it clearly in the dark. "You needed it." There was a small pause. "Yeah," he admitted. "Maybe I did." After that, the room went quiet again. Not the heavy silence I had gotten used to over the past few months. This one felt calmer, easier. Eventually, he shifted a little closer toward the center of the bed, probably without even realizing it. I stayed where I was, still near the edge. But the distance between us was no longer as big as before. Outside, the wind continued moving through the trees, and the cabin settled into the quiet rhythm of the mountains. We both closed our eyes eventually, but, judging from the occasional movement beside me, neither of us slept very well that night. Morning light slipped through the cabin window earlier than I expected. For a moment, I didn't move. I just lay there, staring at the pale sunlight stretching across the wooden ceiling. Then, I became aware of something else, warmth beside me. Sometime during the night, the distance between us had closed. Not completely, but closer than when we first lay down. Our shoulders were only a few inches apart now. He was still asleep. His breathing was slow and steady, one arm resting loosely across the blanket. The quiet expression on his face looked different from the tired one I had gotten used to seeing over the past months. Peaceful. I slipped quietly out of bed so I wouldn't wake him and started making coffee in the small kitchen. A few minutes later, I heard him stir. "Smells good," he mumbled as he walked over, still half asleep. We drank coffee outside the cabin while the morning air slowly warmed. The mountains were quiet except for birds and the wind moving through the trees. The rest of the day was simple. We hiked along a narrow trail that wound through tall pines and rocky hills. Nothing difficult, just enough to keep moving. Sometimes we talked, sometimes we didn't. But the silence felt different now, lighter. At one point, he said something stupid about how I walked like an old man on steep trails. I shoved him, and for a brief second, he laughed. Not just a small smile, a real laugh. It surprised both of us. For the first time in months, he actually looked like himself again. By the time we returned to the cabin, the sky was already turning orange behind the mountains. Night was coming again. And without saying it out loud, I think we both knew the second night would feel different. By the time we got back to the cabin, the air had turned cooler again, the kind of mountain cold that slowly creeps in once the sun disappears behind the trees. We dropped our backpacks by the door and stretched our sore shoulders like two old men pretending we weren't tired. He walked over to the small window and looked outside for a moment. "Not bad," he said quietly. It wasn't just about the view, I could tell. For the first time since everything happened, there was something in his voice that sounded normal. We made a simple dinner, nothing special, just heated food from the small supplies we brought. Afterward, we sat outside again for a while, watching the last light fade from the sky. The mountains at night had their own kind of silence, not empty, just calm. Eventually, he stood up and grabbed his towel. "I'm showering first," he said. "Go ahead." The bathroom door closed, and a moment later, the sound of water filled the cabin. I stayed on the couch, staring at nothing in particular, listening to the steady rush of the shower. For some reason, my mind kept replaying the moment earlier that day when he laughed on the trail. It had been months since I'd heard that. The water stopped after a while. A few seconds later, the bathroom door opened. He stepped out wearing only a towel wrapped loosely around his waist, rubbing his wet hair with another one. I wasn't expecting it. For a second, I just froze. Water still clung to his shoulders, sliding slowly down his chest as he walked across the room. The warm light from the cabin lamp caught the droplets on his skin. Without thinking, my eyes followed the movement. Then, I quickly looked away. He noticed. Of course he noticed. A small grin appeared on his face. "What?" he asked. "Nothing." He kept drying his hair, clearly amused. "You're acting weird." "I'm not." "Yeah, you are." I shook my head and grabbed my own towel from my bag, trying to ignore the fact that he was still standing there half-dressed in the middle of the room. "We've known each other since we were kids," he said casually. "You don't need to be shy now." "I'm not shy," I muttered. That only made him laugh under his breath. The bathroom suddenly felt like a very good place to escape to, so I walked in and closed the door behind me. The shower helped clear my head a little. When I stepped back into the cabin a few minutes later, he was already sitting on the edge of the bed, scrolling through something on his phone. He looked up briefly. "All yours." I nodded and moved around the room quietly, changing into a t-shirt and shorts before turning off the main light. The cabin fell into a softer glow from the small lamp near the bed. Just like the night before, we climbed in from opposite sides. But this time, the space between us felt smaller from the start. Neither of us mentioned it. For a while, we just lay there listening to the quiet sounds outside, the trees moving with the wind, the faint creak of the wooden walls. Then he spoke. "Do you ever think about how fast things change?" His voice sounded thoughtful, not heavy like before, but reflective. "Sometimes," I said. He stared at the ceiling for a while. I thought I had everything figured out. I didn't need him to explain what he meant. "I finally met someone I wanted to spend my life with," he continued quietly. "We had plans. A house, maybe kids someday." His voice faded for a moment, and then it was just gone. I turned my head slightly toward him. The dim light from the lamp outlined his face in soft shadows. "I still wake up sometimes expecting her to be there," he said. Then, I remember. Neither of us spoke for a moment. The mountains outside were completely silent now. After a while, he exhaled slowly. "I don't even know what the rest of my life is supposed to look like anymore." The words hung quietly in the air between us. Without realizing it, I had shifted a little closer toward the center of the bed. This time, he didn't move away. Our shoulders weren't touching, but they were close enough that I could feel the warmth from his body through the blanket. "You don't have to figure everything out right now," I said softly. He turned his head slightly toward me. "Easy for you to say." "Maybe," I admitted. "But you're not alone in it." For a few seconds, we just looked at each other. Not intensely, just present. Eventually, he looked away again, staring back up at the ceiling. "Thanks," he said quietly. "For what?" "For not giving up on me." The distance between us stayed the same after that. Closer than the first night. Not quite touching, but the space that had once felt so noticeable now felt natural. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees again. The quiet of the cabin wrapped around us, and sometime later, without either of us saying another word, we both drifted off to sleep. The third day arrived quietly, but I had no idea the last day of our trip would change everything between us forever. We woke up later than usual, made coffee again, and spent most of the day walking a longer trail that curved along the side of the mountain. The sky was clear, the air cool enough to keep us comfortable while we climbed. Sometimes we talked, sometimes we didn't. But it felt easier now, like the tension that had followed him for months had loosened just a little out here. At one point, we stopped near a rocky overlook where the valley spread out below us. He stood there for a while with his hands resting on the railing, staring out at the distance. "You picked a good place," he said. I shrugged. "Figured the mountains wouldn't judge you for being quiet." That made him smile. Not a big one, just a small curve of his lips. But it was real. By the time we returned to the cabin that evening, both of us were tired from the hike. We made a simple dinner again, ate at the small wooden table, and talked about random things, old memories, stupid stories from years ago, people we used to know. For a while, it almost felt like everything was normal again. Later that night, we went through the same routine as before. One showered, then the other. The cabin grew quiet once the lights were dimmed, and we climbed into bed. Like the previous night, we lay closer than we had on the first. Not touching, just comfortable. Eventually, the sounds of the forest faded into the background, and sleep came easily after the long day. I'm not sure what time it was when I woke up. The cabin was dark except for faint moonlight coming through the window. At first, I thought something outside had made a noise. Then I heard it again, a quiet breath, shaky. I turned my head. He was sitting up slightly beside me, one hand covering his face. For a moment, I didn't move. I already knew what it was. He tried to stay quiet, but another breath slipped out rougher this time. "Hey," I whispered. He didn't answer. His shoulders were trembling. I pushed myself up slowly and sat beside him. "You okay?" A stupid question. Of course he wasn't. He lowered his hand slightly, but he still avoided looking at me. "I'm sorry," he muttered. "For what?" "For this. You don't need to apologize." He shook his head, wiping quickly at his eyes like he was frustrated with himself. "I thought I was getting better," he said quietly. "Today felt normal. It was normal." "That's the problem," he whispered. He stared down at his hands. "For a few hours I forgot." His voice cracked, and then I remembered. "She's gone." The words hit harder in the silence of the cabin. "I keep thinking about that day," he continued, barely above a whisper. "What if I had driven instead? What if I had left work earlier? What if I had been there?" "You can't do that to yourself," I said gently. "But I do," he replied. every night. He finally looked up at me then, and the pain in his eyes made my chest tighten. I should have protected her. Without thinking, I reached out and pulled him toward me. At first, he resisted slightly, like he wasn't sure if he should let himself fall apart like that. Then the tension left his shoulders. He leaned into me. His forehead rested against my shoulder as the quiet crying returned, heavier now that he wasn't trying to hold it back. I wrapped my arms around him and just stayed there. No words, just letting him breathe. The minutes stretched quietly in the dark. Eventually, his breathing slowed, but he didn't move away. Instead, he stayed close, his hands lightly gripping the fabric of my shirt like he needed something solid to hold on to. I could feel the warmth of his breath against my neck. When he finally lifted his head, our faces were closer than either of us had realized. For a while, neither of us spoke. The cabin was quiet, except for the faint sound of wind brushing through the trees outside. The moonlight slipping through the window gave just enough light to see the outline of the room. After a moment, he wiped his face with the back of his hand, trying to pull himself together. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "You don't need to apologize." "I do," he insisted softly. "You brought me all the way out here to relax, and I'm sitting here crying like this." "You're allowed to," I said. "You've been holding everything in for months." He didn't answer right away. For a few seconds, he just stared at the floor, like he was thinking about something he wasn't sure he wanted to say out loud. Then he sighed. "I thought I was doing better today." "You were. That's the strange part," he said. "For a few hours, I almost felt normal again." His voice grew quieter, and then it hits me again that she's gone. The weight in his words hung in the air between us. "I keep thinking about the future we planned," he continued slowly. "All the things we talked about. The house we wanted, the places we wanted to travel. Even stupid little things like arguing about what color the kitchen should be." He shook his head slightly. "Now it's just empty." I didn't interrupt him. Sometimes people just need someone to listen. "I don't even know who I am without that life anymore," he said after a moment. "Everything I imagined for myself disappeared in one day." His voice cracked slightly. "I keep wondering what the point of anything is now." For a second, I didn't know what to say. Then I answered honestly. "The point is that you're still here." He looked up at me. "That doesn't feel like enough." "Maybe not right now," I admitted, "but it will be someday." He studied my face for a moment. "You sound very sure about that." "I am." A faint, tired smile crossed his face. "Why?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean? Why are you so sure things will get better for me?" I hesitated. Then I realized the truth was simpler than I had been making it. "Because you're not alone," I said. He frowned slightly. "I've been alone for months." "No," I said quietly. "You haven't." He waited for me to explain. So I did. "I've been here the whole time," I said, "checking on you, calling you, showing up even when you didn't answer." His eyes softened a little. "I noticed," he admitted. "Good," I said with a small breath of a laugh. "Because I wasn't exactly subtle." The faintest hint of a smile appeared on his face. Then his expression grew serious again. "Why did you stay?" he asked. "Because you matter to me." He didn't look away, so I continued. "You've always mattered to me." He searched my face quietly, like he was trying to understand something deeper behind the words. "You didn't have to do all that," he said softly. "Most people would have stopped trying after a while. I'm not most people." "Why not?" I took a slow breath, because the answer was simple, but saying it out loud still felt bigger than the moment. "Because I care about you, Dave." The room fell quiet again. "I care about you a lot," I added gently. For a few seconds, he didn't move. Then his hand slowly reached up and rested against my arm. "Thank you," he said. The words were soft, but they carried something warm with them. Neither of us pulled away. The space between us felt smaller now, the quiet of the cabin wrapping around the moment. "I'm really glad you brought me here," he said. There was still sadness there. "But something else too." Then we both fell quiet again. Neither of us moved. Neither of us pulled away. The moment felt suspended in that still mountain air. Then he looked at me again, and before I could really think about it, I leaned forward slightly. The kiss was gentle, soft, more like a question than anything else. For half a second, I wondered if I had just made a mistake. Then I felt his hand tighten slightly against my back. He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into it. When we finally separated, neither of us said anything. There wasn't really anything to explain. He just rested his forehead against mine for a moment, breathing slowly. Then we lay back down. This time, there was no space between us. He wrapped one arm around me, almost instinctively, like he didn't want to lose the comfort of the moment. And sometime later, still holding each other in the quiet cabin, we both fell asleep. Morning light slipped quietly into the cabin. At first, I didn't open my eyes. I just felt the warmth. Then, I remembered. His arm was still around me. For a second, I wondered if I had imagined everything from the night before. The crying, the conversation, the kiss. But when I shifted slightly, his grip tightened just a little, like he was still half asleep and didn't want to let go. That answered the question. I opened my eyes. Soft sunlight was spreading across the wooden floor, and the mountains outside the window were glowing in that pale morning color that only happens early in the day. He stirred beside me. A moment later, he slowly opened his eyes too. For a brief second, neither of us spoke. I waited for awkwardness, for confusion, for that strange moment when two people suddenly don't know how to act around each other. But it didn't happen. Instead, he just looked at me quietly. Then, the corner of his mouth lifted into a small smile. Not the polite kind, a real one. "You're still here," he said softly. "Where else would I go?" That made him breathe out a quiet laugh. He looked up at the ceiling for a moment, like he was thinking about something. Then he said something I hadn't expected. "Last night, I slept better than I have in months." There was no embarrassment in his voice, no regret, just honesty. We stayed there a little longer, not rushing to get up. The morning felt calm in a way the past few months never had. Eventually, we got out of bed and made coffee again, just like the morning before. But this time, something had shifted between us. Not dramatically, just naturally. We stood outside the cabin with our cups while the sun slowly climbed above the trees. The mountains looked endless from where we stood. After a while, he spoke again. "You know something?" "What?" "I almost didn't come on this trip." "I know." He nodded slightly. "I'm glad you didn't give up on me." I didn't answer right away, because the truth was, I never would have. He looked out at the mountains again, then back at me. For the first time since the accident, his eyes didn't look lost anymore. They looked alive. Not completely healed, but moving forward. Then he nudged my shoulder lightly. "So," he said, a hint of that old playful tone returning. "Same cabin next year?" I smiled. "Yeah," I said. "I think I'd like that." And for the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel so heavy anymore. So, thanks for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe if you enjoyed this love story. See you soon.